Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between? I want to see how far this story can reach. Now, lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The dust never settled in Dustfall, Arizona territory. It hung in the air like a curse, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that made the town feel perpetually dirty, perpetually forgotten by God and decent folk alike. Thomas McKenna walked down the main street with the measured gait of a man who had learned to conserve his energy for things that mattered, his weathered boots making soft impressions in the packed earth that would be erased by the next wind. At 62, Tom carried himself with the careful posture of someone who had once worn authority like a second skin, but had since learned that power was as fragile as morning frost. His face was a roadmap of hard years, deep lines carved by desert sun and grief, gray stubble that he shaved only when absolutely necessary, and pale blue eyes that had seen too much to ever look truly surprised again. The worn leather saddlebag slung over his shoulder contained everything he owned, a few changes of clothes, basic gunsmithing tools, a small Bible his wife had given him on their wedding day, and $43 that represented his entire fortune after 20 years of drifting from town to town, fixing what could be fixed and moving on when it couldn't. He had come to Dustfall for the same reason he went anywhere, because it was somewhere else, and somewhere else was always preferable to wherever he had been. The town was typical of territorial settlements that had sprouted like weeds around mining claims and railroad stops. One main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon that never closed, a general store that charged twice what things were worth, and the inevitable collection of desperate souls looking for something they would never find. The sheriff's office squatted at the end of Main Street like a toad on a lily pad, its adobe walls painted white but stained brown with dust and neglect. Tom was walking past, intending to inquire about work at the nearby livery stable, when the commotion outside the jail caught his attention. A crowd had gathered in the lazy way that crowds formed in small towns when entertainment was scarce and cruelty was abundant. At the center of the gathering stood 3 young men who bore the soft look of bullies who had never faced real consequences for their actions. The Garrett brothers, Tom would learn later. Though at that moment they were simply 3 examples of what happened when privilege met stupidity and was allowed to ferment in the desert heat. The largest of them, probably 25 and running to fat despite his youth, had backed someone against the jail's wall. His brothers flanked him like jackals flanking a lion, eager for whatever scraps of violence might fall their way. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the promise of entertainment and the comfortable knowledge that they were watching someone else's misery rather than experiencing their own. "Come on, Chinaman," the large brother was saying, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone who had never needed to hurry for anything in his life. "We all know you took it. Just admit it, and maybe we'll let the sheriff handle this legal-like." Tom moved closer, telling himself he was simply curious about the nature of the disturbance. He had learned long ago not to involve himself in other people's troubles, had paid too high a price for playing hero in a world that punished heroes and rewarded cowards. The person pressed against the jail wall was barely more than a child, maybe 16, with the kind of thin frame that spoke of too much work and too little food. His black hair was cut short in the practical style of someone who couldn't afford regular barbering, and his clothes, while clean, bore the patches and careful mends that marked him as someone who made every possession last as long as humanly possible. But it was his eyes that stopped Tom cold. Dark and intelligent, they held no plea for mercy, no surrender to circumstances. Instead, they burned with a quiet dignity that reminded Tom powerfully of someone he had spent 20 years trying not to remember. The boy, Leeway, though Tom didn't know his name yet, stood with his back against the adobe wall surrounded by hostile faces, but his chin remained raised and his shoulders straight. In his hands, clutched like a talisman against evil, was a small wooden horse. The carving was exquisite, showing a skill that spoke of hours of patient work and an artist's eye for detail. Every line was perfect, every curve balanced, and along the horse's flank, barely visible in the harsh sunlight, were letters carved in a child's careful hand. DM. Tom's world tilted sideways. His breath caught in his throat like a fishhook, and his heart began hammering against his ribs with the force of 20 years' worth of suppressed grief hitting him all at once. The wooden horse was identical, absolutely identical, to the one his son Danny had carved in the weeks before the fever took him. Identical down to the initials that stood for Daniel McKenna, carved with the pride of an 8-year-old boy who wanted the world to know he had made something beautiful. The memories crashed over Tom like a flash flood in an arroyo, carrying with them the full weight of everything he had lost and everything he had run from. Danny sitting at their kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration as he worked the small knife Tom had given him for his 8th birthday. Sarah watching from the stove, flour on her apron and love in her eyes, as she watched her son create something from nothing but wood and determination. "It's for you, Papa," Danny had said, presenting the finished horse with the solemnity of a knight offering tribute to his king. "So you'll always remember that I think you're the best lawman in the whole territory." 3 weeks later, Danny was dead. 2 days after that, Sarah followed him into whatever country lay beyond the reach of fever and heartbreak, and Tom had wrapped the wooden horse in one of Sarah's handkerchiefs and buried it with them, unable to bear the sight of something so beautiful in a world that had suddenly become so ugly. Yet here it was again, or something so like it that the difference didn't matter. In the hands of a Chinese boy being threatened by bullies outside a sheriff's office in a town Tom had never heard of 6 months ago. The impossibility of it made his head spin, but the reality of it was undeniable. Somehow, impossibly, his son's work had found its way across 20 years and however many miles to rest in the hands of another child who needed protection. The universe, it seemed, was offering him a chance at redemption he had never asked for and didn't think he deserved. "Look at him," sneered the middle Garrett brother, a thin young man with the kind of pale mustache that suggested he was trying to look older than his years warranted. "Standing there like he owns the place, like he's got rights." The crowd pressed closer, feeding on the tension like vultures on carrion. Tom recognized the faces around him, store clerks, ranch hands, miners, and assorted drifters who had washed up in Dustfall like debris after a storm. Men who worked hard for little pay and found their entertainment in watching someone else suffer what they themselves feared. "Maybe we should teach him some manners," suggested the youngest Garrett, barely out of his teens but already showing the casual cruelty that marked him as his brother's kin. "Show him how we handle thieves in American towns." Leeway's grip on the wooden horse tightened, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Tom could see the intelligence behind the boy's eyes, could recognize the careful calculation of someone who understood that showing fear would only make things worse. It was the same expression Danny had worn when facing down the older boys who had tried to take his lunch money, the same quiet courage that had made Tom so proud of his son. The largest brother stepped closer, close enough that Leeway would be able to smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough that any sudden movement would be interpreted as aggression. "You hear me talking to you, boy? Or are you too stupid to understand American?" Tom found himself moving before his conscious mind had decided to act. 20 years of living as a ghost, of avoiding involvement, of letting other people's troubles remain other people's troubles, fell away like shed skin. His hand came to rest on the worn grip of his Colt .45, a gesture so automatic it felt like breathing. "That's far enough." His voice cut through the morning air with the quiet authority of a man who had spent years making himself heard over the noise of angry crowds and frightened animals. It was the voice of someone who expected to be obeyed, not because he was louder or stronger than anyone else, but because he carried within himself the absolute certainty that some things were right and some things were wrong, and wrong would not be tolerated while he drew breath. The crowd turned as one, surprised by the interruption. They saw a tall, lean man in his 60s, wearing clothes that had seen better years but were kept clean and mended. Nothing about him suggested wealth or position, but something in his bearing made men step aside without quite knowing why. The Garrett brothers turned with the slow arrogance of predators who had been interrupted during feeding time. They were accustomed to being the most dangerous things in any room, had grown up knowing that their father's badge protected them from the consequences of their actions. "This ain't your business, old man," the largest brother said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone who had never met real opposition. "Best you move along before you get hurt." Tom stepped closer, and something in his movement made several members of the crowd take an involuntary step backward. It was nothing dramatic, nothing that could be easily explained, but there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of experience with violence, of familiarity with situations where words failed and other means became necessary. His hand remained on his gun, not threatening but present, a reminder that some conversations had more than one possible ending. The gesture was noticed by everyone present, particularly by men who knew the difference between someone wearing a gun and someone who knew how to use one. "I'm making it my business," Tom said quietly. His eyes moved from brother to brother, measuring them with the calm assessment of someone who had faced down killers and lived to tell about it. "Now, step away from the boy." The crowd fell silent, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple disagreement between strangers. There was electricity in the air, the kind of tension that preceded lightning strikes and gunfights and the moments when ordinary men discovered what they were really made of. Li Wei remained pressed against the wall, but Tom could see something change in the boy's eyes. Hope, perhaps, or simply the relief of knowing that he was no longer alone against the wolves. The wooden horse remained clutched in his hands, and Tom found himself wondering what chain of events had brought his son's work into this boy's possession. The youngest Garrett brother looked uncertain, glancing between Tom and his older siblings as if seeking guidance about how to proceed. The middle brother's hand had drifted toward his own gun, a nickel-plated thing that looked more decorative than functional. But it was the largest brother who spoke, his voice carrying less certainty than it had moments before. "You got some kind of interest in protecting Chinese thieves, mister?" "I've got an interest in seeing that justice gets done proper," Tom replied. "And what I'm seeing here doesn't look much like justice to me." The truth was more complicated than that, more personal, but Tom wasn't about to explain to a crowd of strangers how a wooden horse had reached across 20 years to grab him by the throat and demand that he act like the man his son had believed him to be. Some truths were too large and too painful to share with people who wouldn't understand them anyway. The middle brother finally found his voice. "You know who our pa is, old man? You know what happens to people who interfere with Garrett family business?" Tom's smile was winter cold and held no humor whatsoever. "Son, I've been threatened by experts. You boys are amateurs." The words carried the ring of absolute truth, and the brothers seemed to sense it. They had spent their lives using their father's reputation as a shield, had never learned to fight their own battles or face opponents who weren't already beaten before the first blow was struck. The crowd shifted restlessly, torn between their desire for entertainment and their growing sense that they were watching something that might end badly for everyone involved. Several of the smarter spectators had already begun edging toward the periphery, ready to claim they had seen nothing if questions were asked later. The sheriff's office door opened with a creak that spoke of hinges that needed oil and a building that needed care. Heavy boots struck the wooden steps with the deliberate rhythm of someone who wanted his approach to be heard and noted by all present. Sheriff Marcus Garrett was a man who had grown into his authority like a snake growing into a larger skin, expanding to fill whatever space was available to him. He stood 6 feet tall and had the kind of thick build that suggested he had once been strong and was now simply large. His badge caught the morning sunlight and threw it back like a signal mirror, and his gun belt rode low on his hips in the manner of someone who wanted everyone to know he was armed. His eyes swept the crowd with the lazy confidence of a man surveying his own property, taking in the faces of people who owed him money, favors, or simply the deference due to someone who held the power of life and death in a territory where federal law was mostly theoretical. When his gaze settled on Tom, something cold flickered in his expression. This was not one of his usual subjects, not a miner who needed his goodwill to keep working, not a merchant who required his protection to stay in business, not a drifter who could be run out of town on a rail if he caused trouble. This was something else entirely. A man who stood like someone accustomed to authority, who wore his gun like someone who knew how to use it, and who was clearly interfering with the natural order of things in Dustfall. "Well, well," Sheriff Garrett said, his voice carrying the kind of false joviality that politicians and confidence men used when they wanted to appear reasonable while being anything but. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation here." He stepped down from the sheriff's office porch with the measured pace of someone who wanted to give the impression that he was in complete control of events. His sons moved slightly aside, creating space for him while maintaining their positions around Lee Way. Tom remained exactly where he was, his hand still resting on his gun, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. 20 years of drifting had taught him to read men quickly and accurately, and what he saw in Marcus Garrett's expression was a combination of cunning, cruelty, and the kind of casual corruption that flourished in places where oversight was minimal and consequences were rare. "Problem here is simple," Garrett continued, his tone suggesting that he was explaining something obvious to someone too stupid to understand it on their own. "We got ourselves a thief, caught red-handed with stolen property. My boys were just helping to maintain order until I could deal with the situation proper." Lee Way's grip on the wooden horse tightened, but he remained silent. Tom could see the boy's intelligence working behind his dark eyes, could sense him evaluating options and finding them all inadequate. "And then," Garrett said, his voice hardening slightly, "some stranger decides to stick his nose where it don't belong, causing a disturbance and interfering with lawful proceedings." The crowd had grown during the confrontation, drawn by the promise of violence and the comfortable knowledge that they were witnessing someone else's downfall. Tom could feel their eyes on him, could sense their anticipation of whatever entertainment might follow. Sheriff Garrett studied Tom with the calculating gaze of a man trying to decide whether he was looking at a threat or simply an annoyance. "You got a name, stranger?" "Tom McKenna." Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the name stirred some half-remembered association. But whatever recognition might have flickered there was quickly buried beneath the confident arrogance of a man who had never faced meaningful opposition in his own territory. "Well, Mr. McKenna, here's how things work in my town. We got laws and we got procedures, and we got a system that keeps the peace and maintains order. Now, I don't know where you come from or what kind of bleeding heart nonsense you might be used to, but in Dustfall, thieves get punished and troublemakers get moved along." Tom's expression remained carefully neutral. But something in his eyes suggested that he was cataloging every word, every gesture, every nuance of the sheriff's performance for future reference. "Looks like we got ourselves a troublemaker who don't understand how justice works in my town," Garrett continued, his voice rising slightly so that the entire crowd could hear him clearly. "Boys, seems this old-timer wants to take responsibility for the Chinaman's crimes." The sheriff's words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, carrying with them implications that everyone present understood perfectly. In a territory where legal authority was whatever the man with the badge said it was, taking responsibility for someone else's crimes was tantamount to accepting whatever punishment the sheriff deemed appropriate. Tom felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had walked into this situation driven by impulse and memory, guided by the impossible presence of his son's wooden horse in a stranger's hands. Now he found himself committed to a course of action that could end with his death or worse. But as he looked at Li Wei, saw the quiet courage in the boy's dark eyes, saw the way he clutched the wooden horse like a talisman against evil, Tom knew he couldn't walk away. Some debts transcended rational calculation, some obligations reached across the grave to demand payment in the currency of honor and sacrifice. "That's right," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. "I'll stand for the boy." The sheriff's smile was the cold grin of a predator who had just seen his prey walk into a trap of its own making. "Well, now that's mighty interesting. Mighty interesting indeed." Li Wei's eyes widened slightly, and Tom could see him struggling with the urge to speak, to protest, to somehow release this stranger from an obligation he had never asked him to assume. But the boy remained silent, understanding instinctively that words would only make the situation worse. Sheriff Garrett began walking in a slow circle around Tom and Li Wei, like a buzzard circling something that wasn't quite dead yet. His sons and the crowd formed a loose ring around them, creating an impromptu arena where whatever followed would play out under the desert sun. "See, the thing about taking responsibility," Garrett said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man explaining rules to someone who had no choice but to play by them, "is that responsibility comes with consequences. You stand for the boy, you answer for his crimes, you pay his debts." Tom had faced down killers and cattle rustlers, had walked into saloons full of armed men and emerged alive, had worn a badge in towns where the only law was what a man could enforce with his gun and his courage. But standing in the dusty street of Dustfall, surrounded by hostile faces and committed to protecting a boy he barely knew, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came when death was a very real possibility. "What's the boy accused of?" Tom asked, though he suspected the answer would be whatever served the sheriff's purposes best. "Theft," Garrett replied promptly. "Took a valuable item from Hendrix's general store, worth maybe $20, which makes it grand larceny under territorial law." Li Wei's eyes flashed with anger at the lie, but he remained silent. Tom could see the intelligence working behind the boy's expression, could sense him calculating odds and finding them all unfavorable. "And the penalty for grand larceny?" Tom asked, though he already knew the answer. "Well, now, that depends," Garrett said, his grin widening. "Could be prison time. Could be a fine he can't pay, which means indentured servitude to work off the debt. Could be other things." As Sheriff Garrett continued his theatrical circling, Tom found his gaze drawn again to the wooden horse in Li Wei's hands. The sight of it stirred memories that he had spent 20 years trying to bury. Memories of a time when he had believed in justice and law and the possibility that good men could make a difference in an imperfect world. Danny's voice echoed across the years. "Papa, why do you carry a badge?" "Because someone has to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, son. Because the strong have a duty to protect the weak, and because if good men don't fight for what's right, then bad men will win by default." "And you're a good man, Papa?" "I try to be, Danny. I try every day to be the kind of man you can be proud of." The conversation had taken place 3 days before the fever struck, 3 days before Tom's world collapsed into grief and guilt, and the terrible knowledge that all his talk about protecting people hadn't been enough to save the 2 people who mattered most to him. But standing here now, watching Li Wei clutch his son's handiwork with the same desperate hope that Danny had once shown when facing down playground bullies, Tom felt something stirring in his chest that he had thought was dead forever. Not quite hope, not yet, but something that might grow into hope if properly tended. The boy needed someone to stand up for him, The situation was unjust, corrupt, designed to destroy an innocent person for the profit and entertainment of those with power. And Tom McKenna, whatever else he might have become in 20 years of running from his failures, was still the man who had taught his son that strength carried with it the obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The spectators pressed closer, drawn by the promise of violence and the comfortable knowledge that they were watching someone else's destruction. Tom could see the hunger in their faces, the anticipation of entertainment that would break the monotony of their hard lives. These were not evil people, Tom understood. They were simply ordinary folk who had learned to take their pleasures where they could find them, who had been ground down by hard work and harder luck until watching someone else suffer had become a form of relief. In different circumstances, many of them might have been decent neighbors, helpful citizens, the kind of people who formed the backbone of civilized society. But circumstances mattered, and in Dustfall, under Sheriff Garrett's rule, they had learned that might made right and that mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. They had seen what happened to people who crossed the Garrett family, had witnessed the systematic destruction of anyone who challenged the established order. So they watched and waited, hoping for blood to spill in the dust, hoping for screams to break the desert silence, hoping for someone else's pain to make their own lives seem a little less desperate. Li Wei seemed to sense their hunger, seemed to understand that he had become the focus of something larger and darker than simple theft accusations. His grip on the wooden horse tightened until his knuckles went white, and Tom could see the boy's chest rising and falling with carefully controlled breathing. Sheriff Garrett completed his circle and came to a stop directly in front of Tom, close enough that Tom could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the calculating cruelty in his pale eyes. This was a man who enjoyed his power, who took pleasure in the fear he could inspire in others. Now, Mr. McKenna, since you're so eager to take responsibility for the boy's crimes, I'm going to make you a generous offer. A sporting proposition, you might say. Tom waited, understanding that whatever followed would be designed to humiliate him while providing maximum entertainment for the crowd. Garrett was clearly a man who understood the value of spectacle, who knew that public displays of power were worth more than private acts of cruelty. "See, I'm a fair man," Garrett continued, his voice carrying the false sincerity of a snake oil salesman. "I believe in giving folks a chance to prove themselves, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you and the boy exactly 24 hours to prove his innocence. If you can do that, if you can show me evidence that he didn't steal anything from Hendrix's store, then I'll let you both walk away free and clear." The crowd murmured with disappointment. They had been hoping for immediate violence, for blood to be spilled in the dust under the morning sun. A delay meant uncertainty, meant they might not get the entertainment they had been promised. But Tom could see the trap hidden in the sheriff's offer. 24 hours was not enough time to gather evidence, not enough time to mount a proper defense, especially for a Chinese immigrant who would find no allies among the townspeople. "Of course," Garrett continued, his smile widening, "if you can't prove his innocence to my satisfaction, then you'll both face the full penalty of the law. And since you've made yourself responsible for his crimes, you'll face it together." Li Wei's eyes widened slightly as he began to understand the full dimensions of the trap that had been laid for them. This wasn't about justice or law or even simple theft. This was about power and entertainment and the casual cruelty of men who had never faced consequences for their actions. Tom felt the familiar cold clarity that had always come to him in moments of extreme danger. His mind began cataloging options, calculating odds, searching for some advantage that might allow him and the boy to survive the next 24 hours. "And just to make things interesting," Garrett added, "during those 24 hours, you'll both be my guests here in town. Can't have you riding off into the sunset before justice is served, can we?" The crowd chuckled at this, understanding that they were witnessing not just the setup for tomorrow's entertainment, but also the systematic destruction of two people who had dared to challenge the established order. Tom looked at Li Wei, saw the fear and resignation warring in the boy's dark eyes, saw him clutching the wooden horse like a lifeline in a storm. And in that moment, Tom made the same choice his son Danny would have made, the choice Sarah would have expected him to make, the choice that 20 years of running and hiding had not been able to erase from his fundamental nature. "Agreed," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent crowd with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Sheriff Garrett's grin was triumphant, the expression of a man who had just maneuvered his opponents into an impossible position. "Well then, Mr. McKenna, it looks like you and your young friend are going to be spending some time in my jail while you work on proving his innocence." The crowd began to disperse, satisfied that they had witnessed the opening act of tomorrow's main event. They would spend the day speculating about what would happen when the 24 hours expired, placing informal bets on whether the stranger and the Chinese boy would try to run or would face whatever justice Sheriff Garrett had in mind. Tom placed a gentle hand on Li Wei's shoulder, feeling the boy's tension like a coiled spring. "Come on, son," he said quietly. "Let's see what kind of hospitality the sheriff has to offer." Li Wei looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and fear. He spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. His English heavily accented but clear. "Why you help me? You not know me." Tom looked down at the wooden horse still clutched in the boy's hands, saw his son's initials carved into the wood with a child's careful pride, and felt 20 years of grief and guilt shift slightly in his chest. "Sometimes a man doesn't need a reason to do what's right," Tom said. "Sometimes the reason finds him." As they walked toward the sheriff's office, Tom found himself wondering what chain of events had brought his son's handiwork to this place, to this moment. But more importantly, he found himself wondering if an old man who had spent 20 years running from his failures might still have enough fight left in him to honor the memory of a boy who had believed his father was a hero. The jail door closed behind them with the solid finality of a coffin lid, and Tom found himself in a world where justice was whatever Sheriff Garrett said it was, where law was a tool of oppression rather than protection, and where an old man's promise to a dead son would be tested against the harsh realities of territorial politics and racial hatred. But as he watched Li Wei carefully place the wooden horse on the small table in their shared cell, as he saw the boy's careful reverence for something his own son had created with love and pride, Tom felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant for 20 years. Not quite hope, not yet. But the possibility of hope, the chance that an old lawman who had lost his way might find a path back to the man he had once been, the man his son had believed him to be. Outside, the desert sun climbed higher into a sky the color of faded denim, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried its ancient challenge to the wind. Inside the jail, two unlikely allies prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring, bound together by shared danger and the mysterious providence that had brought them together in this forgotten corner of the American frontier. The wooden horse sat on the table between them, a bridge across cultures and generations, a reminder that some debts could only be paid in the currency of courage, and that some promises reached across the grave to demand fulfillment in the most unexpected ways. As darkness settled over Dustfall like a blanket thrown over a dying fire, Tom sat on the narrow cot in their shared cell and watched Li Wei examine the wooden horse with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that held the key to his survival. The boy's fingers traced the carved lines with reverent care, following the flow of mane and muscle that Danny had captured with the intuitive skill of a born artist. When he reached the initials carved into the horse's flank, he looked up at Tom with eyes that held questions he didn't know how to ask. "My son made that," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying across the small space like a confession offered to the darkness. 20 years ago, just before he died." Li Wei's eyes widened with understanding and something that might have been awe. He held the horse out toward Tom. offering to return something that had clearly found its way across impossible distances to deliver a message from beyond the grave. But Tom shook his head gently. "You keep it, son. I think it was meant to find you." Outside their cell, the night sounds of a frontier town settled into the familiar rhythm of commerce and sin. The piano music from the saloon, the laughter of men spending money they couldn't afford on pleasures they would regret in the morning, the occasional gunshot that might be celebration or might be something darker. Tomorrow would bring whatever justice Sheriff Garrett had in mind, whatever entertainment the town demanded, whatever reckoning 20 years of running had prepared him to face. But tonight, in a jail cell in a forgotten corner of the American frontier, an old man and a young boy sat together in the darkness, bound by shared danger and the mysterious workings of Providence, preparing to discover what they were really made of when everything else was stripped away. The wooden horse sat between them like a promise, like a prayer, like a reminder that some bonds transcended death itself and that some debts could only be paid by choosing courage over safety, honor over survival, and love over fear when the moment of truth finally arrived.